This is Chapter 10, Reluctance Illustrated, Policy Uncertainty During the Presidency of Bill Clinton. I want to start off by saying this might be a little longer than normal, but I tried to condense it as much as I could. So first we have Clinton's background. Before being elected, the public was unsure where he stood. He had a combination of liberal and conservative views, and he supported a number of policies on both sides. And he viewed himself as a social reformer, but sometimes he backtracked in order to save face in front of his Democratic Party members. Both the public and other party members were very afraid that he lacked deep convictions, which led to uncertainty following the presidential campaign, or leading up to the presidential campaign. In the presidential campaign of '92, he talked a lot about relieving the deficit. He advocated for immediate or stimulus spending, promised to reform the healthcare system, advocated to overturn homophobic bans in the military, promised to increase taxes on the rich, promised tax cuts for middle-class Americans, and promised to enact welfare reforms, as well as a number of other things. Some issues and options that he had to face were that he made a lot of contradictory promises during his campaign. He promised to eliminate the deficit, but he also promised to fund a number of social programs and tax cuts for the middle class. The current economic statement that he had to make a choice between increasing taxes or cutting spending on existing programs that he was supposed to support. He was also advised to cut the deficit, but to keep his promises of healthcare and welfare reform, which obviously would be difficult, but with the Democrats in control of Congress, he had the leverage needed to enact social reforms and carry out his own liberal agenda. The budget process is condensed by a lot here, but basically the president will submit a proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. The budget will outline how much money is allocated for different programs, whether or not there will be new or the same taxes, an estimate of the deficit, an estimate of the budget's impact on the deficit, and federal spending on entitlements and discretionary spending. Then the Budget Committee will review the budget. Each chamber will vote on a budget resolution that was created based on the committee review. Then the budget resolution compromise is negotiated and ratified. The resulting budget resolution instructs particular congressional committees, including the Tax Legislation Committee, to increase or decrease spending, or in their case taxes, by a stipulated amount. Then Congress will implement one of two tracks, the first being dealing with entitlements and tax legislation, and the second being a legislative committee and appropriations committees dealing with domestic discretionary programs. Then the recommendations will come from Congress. It will be one of two kinds of recommendations. There are two kinds of recommendations that come from Congress. The first is each chamber bundles entitlement and tax recommendations into a reconciliation bill, or each chamber develops 13 separate appropriations bills that conform to guidelines on the budget resolution. And both of these are compromised and ratified by each chamber, and the president will decide to sign or veto the recommendations from both tracks. There are four facets of the budget process, or the budget in general, that are very important to social workers. The first is the funding of entitlements, the second is domestic discretionary spending, the third being tax policy, and the fourth being military spending. All of these have an impact on programs or funds for programs that are important to social workers and their clients. The demise of the stimulus package is seen here. Clinton proposed two kinds of new spending, those being immediate economic stimulus and social investments. The stimulus spending was vulnerable as it was a small amount, wouldn't do much difference. There were many expenditures that came along with it, and conservatives were very likely to attack it, which meant that he would face lots of opposition and have to take time to reconcile that. After a lot of lobbying, it was passed, but it then faced opposition from other Democrats, which led to a compromise that spending be reduced except for a set amount of $4 billion to fund extensions of unemployment insurance. The fight for health reform is outlined heavily in this chapter. It starts with the healthcare system, which at the time revolved around employers and private insurance companies. This doesn't always work for everyone. Medicare and Medicaid helps the elderly and unemployed and poor, but is expensive. And private health insurance added huge costs to the medical system in general. So there was resistance that came from people who already had insurance that feared that their coverage would suffer because of people that were also going to benefit from the new type. And then there was a lack of votes from the populations who actually needed it. But Clinton prioritized the reform anyway, which meant a lot of large costs coming his way. He negotiated the details of health reform and relied on tax hikes and on cigarettes and cuts in existing programs, as well as savings from efficiencies in order to fund it. But he rejected the single-payer system because he knew that doctors would oppose it, conservatives would see it as a big government scheme, and it would also require a multitude of government resources. Health reform continued here. The provisions of the Clinton plan are laid out on this slide. Employers would be required to fund health care for their employees. The government would fund the purchase of private health insurance policies for unemployed people or part-time workers. The government would establish the basic minimum coverage on all policies. Regional health care alliances developed to publicize competing policies so they would be publicized, so consumers could select the plan they wanted or change plans if they wanted to. Private insurance companies wouldn't be allowed to discontinue coverage with pre-existing conditions, and the government would develop control over prices charged by pharmaceutical companies for drugs. The government would provide Americans with a health security card to be used when seeking services, and Medicare and Medicaid would remain, but enrollees could join competing plans if they so chose to. And the last slide outlines the opposition, logistical issues, momentum, and defeat of the health reform. Many people opposed it because of the complexity of it. There was a lot that went into it, and it was very confusing for most people to understand. There were logistical issues as healthcare operates under 3 different House committees and 2 different Senate committees. It lost momentum because there were many people invested in maintaining the status quo, and there was the thought that it wasn't for sure that any health reform plan would have been passed in the state of the economy in 1994, whether that be Clinton's or anyone else's. It eventually was defeated, made Clinton look very inefficient, and only enhanced the public's distaste of gridlock in the government. This is supposed to say how the House Republicans took charge. They continuously portrayed Clinton as a big spender, and leading up to the 1994 election, they gained majority status in both houses of Congress and a majority of the nation's governorships, as well as 17 of the state legislative chambers, and most of these were young and ultra-conservative. Then the contract comes. It is articulated early in 1994, and the basic tenets include individual liberty, economic opportunity, limited government, personal responsibility, and security at home and abroad. Most of the items of the contract were enacted within 100 days. So this next part takes quite a bit as it outlines the entire contract. I'll just be going over the basics, but there were 10 different parts. These are the first 5. Balancing the budget on tax limitation, strengthening national defense, tax cuts to strengthen families and benefit the middle class, aid to senior citizens, and welfare reform. As you can see, there are a number of subcategories that explain how this will happen. This is a continuation. This is 6 through 10, not 1 through 5 again. So then we have reform of unfunded mandates and incentives to businesses, strengthening the family, legal reforms to curb litigation and anti-crime legislation, and then term limits. Again, the subcategories are describing how these will be carried out. Next, we have the budget confrontation. So Clinton was given a time frame of 7 years to balance the budget. They felt that this would force his administration to make decisions quickly and efficiently. Republicans in the House were still trying to be in control, and they hoped that the public would be in favor of a deficit reduction by way of cutting entitlements, except for Social Security. And the cuts in discretionary spending would not help much because of the previous changes in Clinton's reduction plan of 1993. The Democrats were upset because cuts were the only thing that could achieve the new goal, and they thought this was unfair to Americans that were benefiting from the programs. But then we have Gingrich versus Clinton. So Gingrich demanded deep cuts in social spending and entitlements and wanted an increase in military spending. And Clinton initially refused to accept his demands, but eventually caved at the last minute to accept the cuts, but it would only balance the budget in 10 years, not 7. This caused a government shutdown because they couldn't pay their bills, which created a public upset, and they started questioning and criticizing the large cuts and entitlements that Gingrich had demanded. And all of this leads up to welfare reform controversy when Clinton signed a proposal that removed the welfare issue from the 96 presidential campaign. This proposal retained Medicaid as an entitlement rather than a block grant, and ended AFDC entitlements and provided little resources for child care and job training. This also had a number of provisions. Clinton's second term was outlined by these events. He obtained major educational reforms such as the Hope Scholarship, lifetime learning credits, and educational savings accounts. He had a few scandals during this time as well, including the sexual scandal between him and Monica Lewinsky, and an impeachment trial. Gun control also became a rising issue, as there were several mass shootings that occurred, and the event Columbine, which we all know of. But because of this, he sought bans on gun sales online and at gun shows, and wanted to expand background checks of purchasers of guns, and increase the age for purchasing from 18 to 21. Then there was Medicare and Medicaid expansion, which expanded to include prescription drug coverage. It highlighted abuse by central administrators, and that was fought back with lawsuits by social workers, specifically with central administrators giving gag orders to certain physicians about certain procedures or medications that they could provide but didn't want to, or that they thought might be taken advantage of. And then legislation also required private health insurance companies not to discriminate against mental health problems in their plans. And finally, Clinton enacted a children's health insurance program to give grants of $20 billion to the states to provide uninsured children with insurance. Now we have the oppression of vulnerable populations, starting with the oppression of women. First, we have reproductive rights, which were under attack by conservatives who wanted to block the use of federal funds for abortions, attached riders for more restrictions, and hoped to make late-term abortions illegal. Any victories that were seen in this time were offset by the wage gap as well as the glass ceiling, which are still very prevalent today, and they were threatened by the possible elimination of affirmative action, which also plays into the oppression of peoples of color in the next slide. The oppression of people of color was seen in a number of ways, the main ones being, again, the possible elimination of affirmative action, the depletion of career and collegiate gains, the releases of books diminishing character, and in these books, the authors stated that people of color were genetically predisposed to have lower intelligence. One of these books was titled The End of Racism, and both of the books mentioned within the text only provided a very simplistic analysis and explanation of largely complex phenomena. There was also a decrease in college enrollment of peoples of color, which caused a huge debate over admissions criteria in universities nationwide. And of course, there were increased incarceration rates because of the new legislation on crack versus powder cocaine and how those crimes would be resolved. Then we have the oppression of immigrants. This was mainly seen in Proposition 187, which was in California. It stated that illegal immigrants were ineligible for medical, social, and educational services, which triggered a national debate about immigration. There were three different groups. Those would be legal, illegal, and uncertain status. And this was eventually not passed due to large confusion and opposition, as well as a very large ethical debate. Then we have the oppression of children. So there was a threat of increase of children in poverty whenever there was the elimination of entitlement status for AFDC and the block granting of food stamps and revision of Medicaid policies that were intended to end the inclusion of children over 12. Social workers were often moving on to the foster system and all that involves. Social workers were often blamed for failing to see child abuse, and they were more than likely carrying caseloads of over 50, despite the fact that they're only recommended to carry no more than 15 at a time, so they were tremendously overwhelmed. There were acts being enacted that were not intended to increase the welfare and general care of children, but instead to reduce welfare roles, but they were under the guise of being there to provide for the children. An example of this was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Act of 1996. Then we have welfare reform legislation that restricted the eligibility to SSI for children with behavioral disorders. And finally, the Adoption and Safe Families Act passed, which was designated to get adoptions of children and foster care done faster, but had a lot of restrictions and was very confusing, as well as the fact that it was seemingly not carried out very well. Then we have the oppression of gay men and lesbians. Again, Clinton had a campaign promise of ending homophobic military practices, and they came to a compromise to keep the remaining policy in effect for 6 months while they came up with a compromise, which ended up being the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which was accepted, which states that you don't tell your superiors your sexual orientation, and they don't ask about it. And after this was passed, data shows that the number of dismissals did not decrease. And then finally, we have the AIDS epidemic. Obviously, this was very prevalent throughout the 80s, but by this time, panic had decreased, which led to an increase in unsafe sex practices because people felt more safe, which then led to another rise of infections in a full circle, which led to a campaign for HIV education in order to reduce the spread, particularly in low-income areas. Getting towards the end here, we have the illustration of reluctance throughout Clinton's presidency. His second term was severely lacking policy accomplishments. Parties were very stubborn, they were heavily biased, and compromises were very hard to come by. It took a lot of time for a compromise to be developed in general, and some of them didn't even get passed. And his presidency, because of this, is seen as very defensive, as in he was always on the defensive and had little time to devote to enacting a number of other initiatives that he would have liked to. And lastly, we have the link to contemporary society. These are just a few points of what was brought up in this chapter and what we see today. So first, we have the importance of the budget process and acknowledging the complexity of budget politics. As we went over the budget process, like I said, it was very, very condensed, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of people in order to get a budget passed. Then we have welfare reform. It was not a total success or failure. Welfare rolls did decline by about 50% in many states, but about half of women on welfare rolls remained because of personal disabilities or familial disabilities, those being both mental and physical. They came to the conclusion that certain policies help people thrive and that they should be a key part in the American welfare state. Example of these policies would be EITC and Hope Scholarships. The principle of social justice when regarding ethics should also include families with moderate means and not just families with no means. And then finally, social workers should be informed of and be able to provide their clients with information on hidden resources when applicable. And these resources, as stated in the text, are not exactly few and far between. It's just that they're not known about. And if you have the resources to provide to your clients, then you definitely should.